Hello, everyone. My name is Maureen McDowell. I am the founder and executive director of Keep St. Pete Lit. We are a literary arts organization based in St. Petersburg, Florida. And this is episode 31 of Typewriter Talks, a weekly online series where we interview Tampa Bay authors. And today we have Colette Bancroft, who is a journalist for the Tampa Bay Times and its book editor. Colette, thank you for being here.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. Happy to be here.
So you're in the neck of it with the Times Festival of Reading this weekend.
Yes, we're speaking just a couple of days before the festival happens. And usually it happens at the USF St. Pete campus, and we have several thousand people and, about 40 authors. And this year, of course, it can't happen that way.
Yeah.
So this is, we built a virtual festival from the ground up, and it's been very interesting.
I can imagine.
Yeah, and what will happen this week on November 12th through 14th, which is Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, we'll do several live events with authors, and we will also put recorded interviews, Zoom interviews like this one, with more than 40 more authors up on the festival website, talking about their books, as they would normally do in person. And that's festivalofreading.com. I'll say that several more times probably. But over the last 5 or 6 weeks, I've been recording these interviews, and some other staffers have helped me too, but I've done most of them.
That's a lot of work.
It is a lot of work. And I didn't think it through, and I said, well, I'll just record all these interviews. I didn't really think about how much work.
This would be fun.
It was fun. Yeah, I thought it would be fun. And it was
things. Yeah.
It was fun. I mean, I really enjoyed them, but it was a lot in a concentrated period of time. So I hope we can go back to the in-person version of the festival next year. But if we have to do it this way again, I learned a lot. We all learned a lot about what to do and what not to do. So
yeah. We didn't do our Sunlit Festival in the spring, and I don't know if we're going to do it again coming up.
Yeah.
So it's just a tricky time that you have to be innovative, and and you do get Zoom fatigue. You do. And you miss the one-on-one, and you don't get to I'm pick up on people's energy and what's going on with them, and it's
Yeah,
so,
it's not the same, although I'm glad we have it. I mean, it's certainly better than not being able to talk with people at all. But yeah, it's not quite the same. Yeah.
So you just, you edited a book of Tampa Noir, correct?
Yeah, Tampa Bay Noir.
Tampa Bay Noir. So how did that start, that idea?
Look here.
Yay!
It's part of a series that Akashic Books, which is based in Brooklyn, started about 15 years ago. They started with Brooklyn Noir and Miami Noir and Boston Noir. The idea is they're anthologies of short stories set in a specific place, and they're new stories. They're written for these collections.
Oh.
And they're not only set in those locations, they're written by authors who live there or have lived there. And it's been very successful for Akashic. They've done more than 100 of them.
Wow.
They have everything from Addis Ababa Noir to Zagreb Noir. And, it's a global series. And I don't know why it took them so long to get to Tampa Bay, but a couple of years ago, I talked to them, and they asked me to do it. And it was in some ways easy for me because I've been book editor at the Times for about 13 years. I know a lot of local writers, and I knew what a wealth of good writers there were to choose from. I told them I could have done a book with 50 stories.
I know. We're on episode 31, and I haven't even scratched the surface. Of writers in this area. Yeah.
So, but I said about recruiting writers to do it. And Akashic has an interesting approach. They want you to get, if you can, some big name writers who are bestseller, whose books are bestsellers, obviously, because that sort of brings people to the book.
Yeah.
And I was lucky to have get people like Michael Connelly and Lori Roy and Ace Atkins and Lisa Unger and so forth. But they also really stress diversity. So, they have to have half of the writers had to be women, could all be male writers. And they wanted representation of people of color and LGBTQ people. And so it was a little bit like putting a puzzle together to, to check all those boxes. And they also like, besides the established writers, they like the books to include some emerging writers, some people who are early in their careers. Yeah, it's great. It's a wonderful, diversity guideline. And fortunately, as I said, I had so many writers in the Tampa Bay area to choose from that it wasn't hard to meet those standards and have really good writers. So I got 14 writers to agree to do it. And I was gratified that only a couple of people turned me down. And mostly they were people who are already overbooked.
Yeah.
Like Dennis Lehane has done several of these collections. He edited the Boston, one of the original ones. And so he's friends with the publisher. And there were only a couple of people that the publisher said, please ask this person. So I asked Dennis, who moved to Los Angeles a few years ago, can you do this? Because he wrote several books based in Tampa and he lived in St. Pete for about 15 years. And he wrote back and said, I wish I could, but I'm booked to like the middle of 2021. Yeah. And this was 2 years ago. Wow. And he was, so, but most of the people I asked were happy to do it. So.
Do you have another project like that in the works?
I don't at the moment. I'd like to, and I'm sort of looking around and thinking about it because I really enjoyed doing this one. Yeah. They're quite ready for Tampa Bay Noir Volume 2, but
Hey, there's plenty of writers.
There are. Well, the hard part for me was, leaving people out.
Yeah.
I really could have done 50 writers in this book.
Yeah. And there's so many other things, so many other genres that you could have. And if you like doing it, I think it's cool. And then we could be put on the map for our anthologies even more, Yes. So what's a typical day like for you as a writer?
I won't talk about the festival because that's sort of a non-typical time of year, like 2 or 3 months out of my year that are pretty crazy. Yeah. But most of the time I am reading as much as or more than I'm writing because I'm a book critic.
Yeah.
So a lot of my time is spent reading the books that I'll review and also, reading books in order to decide, am I going to review this book? And that often I can read just part of a book and say, well, not this one, but
yeah.
But once I've decided, then I read the entire book. And so I spend a fair amount of my work time reading.
Yeah.
And writing, in terms of writing reviews, which is the main kind of writing that I do, I've done it for many years and I've gotten to where I do it pretty efficiently. Mm-hmm. I can usually, I read a book and I try to give myself, if I can, if I'm on a normal schedule, not a festival schedule, a day or two between when I finish the book and when I write, because I really think it's, my subconscious has a lot to do with it. It's sort of cooking in my brain, I forget who said it, but somebody said, how do I know what I think until I see what I write?
Yeah, I'm the same way.
Yeah. And so, I give myself that time and then I can usually sit down and write a review in a few hours.
Yeah.
And revise and then file it. So I'm pretty efficient at that kind of writing. And other things, some projects take me longer if I'm doing like a profile or some kind of book coverage story that requires research and interviews and that kind of thing can take longer. But I'm also I've been a journalist. I've worked for newspapers for almost 35 years. So
I'm going to ask, how did you get into this role?
Well, I sort of backed into it. I originally went to graduate school, got a master's in English, did all the work for a PhD except finish my dissertation. I wrote a draft of the dissertation, I just never finished it. But during that time, I was also freelancing. I freelanced for magazines and newspapers. I lived in Tampa. And after I taught for like 12 years during graduate school, and then after graduate school as an adjunct and on short appointments and that sort of thing. I taught English. I taught at USF, and I taught at the University of Florida and UT and the University of Arizona. I was that gypsy scholar kind of thing. And then my husband and I moved to Arizona about 35 years ago. And I taught there for a year, but then, and freelanced. And then the newspaper there offered me a full-time job as food editor because I wrote restaurant criticism. My husband and I were restaurant critics. And I took that job and I loved it. I really had a good, I liked teaching, but I loved journalism.
Yeah.
And I was at that newspaper for about 9 years. And I was the restaurant critic the whole time, those whole 9 years. And for 3 of those years, I was the book editor and wrote book reviews. And then when we came back to Florida in the late 90s, I went to work for the Times, and I did a lot of different things at the Times. I was a copy editor and a news editor and a features writer, just a general assignment features reporter. And about 13 years ago, I was offered, but during that time, I wrote a lot of book reviews and theater reviews, movie reviews, and and I was offered the book editor job and said yes. So it was a meandering path, but all those graduate classes in literature sort of paid off later.
Yeah. It's funny how many, with running Keep St. Pete Lit, how many CEOs are English professors.
Mm-hmm.
People that I've met that sponsor us or want to help us. And I'm like, why are you so invested? And they're like, I was a poetry major. Now I'm people I know run an architecture firm. And it's like, oh.
I know lawyers who were English majors.
Kara Behar and Jordan Behar. Behar, who are building the factory that we're moving into. She was an English major and he was a poetry major, and that's how they met. So they're huge supporters of us, and it's like, man, be an English major. It's a gateway to a lot.
It is.
So
some English majors end up making money. Not all of us.
But it might be. It's a good foundation, and it's fun.
It is. It is. It's great, and it adapts.
What would be the advice you would give your younger writer self?
To take more chances. To not be so concerned when writing something when I was younger, is this perfect? Is this, am I going to be embarrassed? Am I going to be criticized? Yes, you are. Get over it, to take more chances. And being a journalist sort of knocked that out of me, in the newsroom, no one is, worried about your feelings. When they want you to file the story and, but before I worked for newspapers, when I was younger, I was too much of a perfectionist. I still am, but I was more fearful than I should have been. I wish I should have taken more chances.
So when you pick a book, because I usually ask like who your favorite authors, and I don't know if it'd be contentious for you to say.
It would be impossible. It's I could probably send you a list of 100.
Yeah, I really.
That's very difficult for me because I read my job. If you're a newspaper book critic, especially, your job is to be a generalist.
Yeah.
My job is not just to pick the books I like that I would read if I were, if I didn't do this for a living. It's to try to get a diverse range of books into the newspaper we have a very broad audience, and so it's less, what I read, that I read what I like, that I read what I think my readers will be interested in. So do you read recreationally for yourself, separate, or? A little bit. I always have something that I'm reading when I go to bed at night.
Yeah, it's very calming.
It is very calming, and it's, but I don't want to read, I don't want that to be a book I have to review, so it's always something other than. And and those books often are nonfiction, essay collections, or, and this is kind of odd, but mysteries. I'm a huge mystery fan. My unfinished dissertation was on Raymond Chandler,
Interesting.
And so, you wouldn't necessarily think mysteries are restful, but I find them to be. So a lot of what I read at night is mysteries or nonfiction, sometimes memoir, that kind of thing.
It depends on what your taste is. Like my daughter is 14 and she has such a taste for kind of the macabre, her artwork is darkish, and we have family members that are like, what's going on with her? And I'm like, nothing. A straight A student.
Yeah, she's 14.
Yeah, and she just, it's just her temperament. It's what she's drawn to, and she loves anime and all these things. And it's funny, like my father loves mysteries too, and I never got into them. So it's just funny to see what people's different tastes are.
Yeah,
the mystery writers watching this are like, ooh, I know what she likes now. But as you said, it's good to say, like, to be a generalist. That is your job.
Yes, and I like lots of different genres. There's very few that I don't like, that I'm not interested in. It's interesting what you say about your daughter, because I get questions from parents sometimes like, what should I tell my child to read, or what should I make your child read? And I always say, let your child read whatever she likes. When I was a kid, I read everything. I read some books I probably shouldn't have read. I read Lolita when I was 12.
I was reading Sybil in 6th grade, this big book about split personality.
Yeah, exactly. I think I read that when I was a kid too.
Yeah.
And, but, you can't make kids like a certain kind of book. And the only way to learn a good book from a bad book is to read them all.
And, I love that.
And and figure out, well, this one is better than that one, and I like this one and I don't like that one. And just let them read. And if they like whatever they like, it might not be what you like, but so what?
It's so funny how many books I've been drawn to by the cover art, and then I would just read it and I just have this feeling I need to read the book. And because we picked the book club books for the Studio 620, and we just read The Memory Police during the election, and it's this book about people losing their memories, and I'm going like, they're going to hate me. Like, it was the day after election day, and it's like people losing their memories, and their, parts of their body disappear. And everybody in the book club was like, because I always ask, did you like it? And they were all like, yeah, this was a beautiful story, and it was just so well written, and it just so atmospheric, and so but it was just funny because it's like you never know where a book's going to take you. But I agree, you can you get hooked quickly.
Yeah. If a book hasn't hooked me pretty quickly, it's probably not going to. If someone says to me, oh, but once you get to page 120, I'm like, I'm not sticking around for page 120. If it doesn't start till 120, they should have cut the first 119.
That's good advice right there. Yeah. Hook them right out of the gate. I mean, it's crazy. I'll read some books in the first paragraph, I'm like, oh my God, I'm in. Like, you're on your couch and you open it up, and the first page, you're in another world.
Right.
That is one of my favorite feelings.
That's a good measure. That's a good sign that,
So one more question, and then we'll hear some from the Tampa Bay Noir. What would be your holy grail piece of writing advice?
Writing is revising. Your first version is not sacred. You can almost always make it better. I revise a lot, and I revise continuously the whole time I'm writing. And I think people are also kind of afraid to revise, and they shouldn't be. think of it as a first draft, emphasis on first.
Yeah.
And that's true for every writer, not whether you've never written before, whether you've been writing. I've been writing since I was a child, and I don't even want to say how long ago that was, but you can still benefit from revision and from editing too. But when you're writing, doing your own writing, revision is essential, I think.
I love how you say that the first draft isn't sacred. And I think that right there is the piece of it. Because I do think that this is a sacred document because we put so much into it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And we sort of feel that way, that old writing advice.
And yeah.
Yeah. Well, Peter Clark used this for the title of his latest book, but Murder Your Darlings.
Yeah, he did, didn't he?
I wrote this. It must be great. Well, maybe not. So.
Craig Pittman, when we interviewed him, he mentioned that he has his writing life is totally tied up with his editor, because his editor, his job is to make his writing better and bring out what he needs to do. And I love that idea. I'd never heard that before, of like working with your editor to craft something even better.
Yeah. And that's really true. And I've been an editor for much of my time as a journalist as well as a writer. And my experience is that the best writers at newspapers are the people most open to being edited and to working with editors. And if you get someone who says, don't mess with my copy, they're probably not going to last.
Yeah. Wow. That's interesting. That's good advice. I did get one more idea. One more question. You said you've been writing since you were a child. So you've always been drawn to writing? Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah. When I was in grade school, I would write the school play.
Oh, wow.
And cast it and direct it.
Oh, wow.
I was very bossy as a child. But yeah, I can't remember when I didn't write. I think I had a poem published in some Catholic magazine. I went to Catholic school, Catholic children's magazine when I was like 8 or something. I don't remember it, but I did.
Were your parents supportive? Did they see?
They were not big readers themselves. Well, my mother read a fair amount. My dad mostly read news. He was a very avid newspaper reader, though, and I think that's why I was always drawn to newspapers. He would read like 3 or 4 newspapers a day. And my mother read books, and yes, they were very supportive of that.
That's great, because I remember I was always reading, and I was always writing something down so young. And so I think parents that see that in their kids nurture that.
Yeah. Although I did occasionally put that book down and go outside, but.
Yeah, that's good too. Have them read outside too. Okay, let's hear some from Tampa Bay Noir.
Okay, this is, as I said, the stories are all set in Tampa Bay. And when I asked these 14 people to contribute, I also had to ask them at the beginning to choose a location, a neighborhood or a town in the Tampa Bay area, because the series, they try to avoid overlap. They don't want, 5 stories set in the same neighborhood. So everybody had to choose a neighborhood. And it worked out well. There was almost no overlap. But I decided to write a story. I had the option to write one or not. The editor of these anthologies can write one or not write one. Yeah. And so I thought, I haven't written fiction in years and years, but there's always some little ideas hanging around. And there was one that I thought would fit. So I decided to write it and send it in. And I told the publisher, if you like this, put it in. And if you don't, leave it out. Won't hurt my feelings, But he liked it. So it's in there. And the neighborhood that it's in Tampa, it's in a neighborhood in South Tampa. And since the book came out, every time I've said the name of that neighborhood, people have said, where's that? I never heard of it. It's called Rattlesnake.
Oh, wow.
It used to be called Rattlesnake. These days, people don't call it that much. But it's the neighborhood right around Gandy Boulevard and West Shore Boulevard.
Okay, I know exactly what you're talking about.
The east end of the Gandy Bridge.
I've used that. Yeah.
And back a long time ago, I think in the 40s and 50s, it was called Rattlesnake because it was not very developed then. That was mostly woods. And there was a rattlesnake canning plant, right?
I love Florida.
Well, that's very Florida. But there were so many rattlesnakes that they would just kind of scoop them up and take them to this factory and, skin them and cook them and can them. And if you probably remember this from your childhood, even that, if you went to Stuckey's along the side of the road or a gas station in Florida, there would be canned rattlesnake meat. Well, that's where it came from.
Wow.
And there was actually a rattlesnake post office. You could get your mail postmarked Rattlesnake, Florida. And so when I grew up in that neighborhood, my parents moved to Florida when I was 6, and we lived there around that area until I went away to college. And back then, it was still called that. Now, as I said, people don't much call it that. But the story is set in Rattlesnake, and it's called The Bite. And this is sort of, the narrator is a 12-year-old girl. And this is about halfway through the story. The rattlesnake canning plant that gave the neighborhood its name was long gone, but the snakes were still around. They had adapted to suburban life, staying mostly invisible, but occasionally slithering through a yard or being discovered under a pile of boxes on someone's carport. My mother had a reputation as a neighborhood snake killer, having learned her technique from her father, who grew up on a farm in Slovakia, where he sometimes dispatched adders. Armed with a shovel, my mother had coolly chopped the heads off more rattlers and copperheads and water moccasins than I could count. One long summer afternoon, my mother had been home from work just long enough to change into her pedal pushers and keds when we heard screaming from next door. Julieta came barreling into our carport shrieking, "Snake, snake," and Mom was out the kitchen door and into the utility room of the carport to grab her shovel. Next door, Mrs. Mendoza was standing at the backyard gate. "Luis has a gun, but he's not home yet. Please help her." Louisa was in a corner of the backyard in a little slot between the fence and the shed. Blocking her path was a pygmy rattler, a coiled ball of fury, its tail vibrating with that unmistakable warning. I couldn't breathe. "Stand real still, honey," my mother said to Louisa in her kindest voice. "Don't move." The snake was focused on Louisa, but when my mother took a step forward and stamped one foot, it swung its head around. She struck, the shovel blade flashing through its extended neck. The coils convulsed, the jaws snapped, the tail fell silent. She swept the beheaded snake aside with the shovel, then grabbed Louisa, who was still standing frozen as a little statue. "Did it bite you, baby?" Louisa shook her head and began to cry as her mother swooped in, kissing her all over and inspecting her for bites at the same time. Julieta craned toward the snake. "Don't touch it," my mother said quickly. "They can bite, even after you cut their heads off." By way of demonstration, she touched the severed head with the tip of the shovel blade, and the snake's jaws jerked wide, then snapped. Mrs. Howard was standing wide-eyed on the sidewalk, hugging herself. I wouldn't have thought she could look any paler, but she did. I realized I'd never seen her cross the street. She motioned me over. "Has your mama done that before?" "Yes, ma'am. She's the rattlesnake snake killer. She's not afraid of anything," I boasted, reflecting a little of my mom's badass glory. Mrs. Howard seemed as frozen as Louisa had been a few minutes ago. Then she took a shuddering breath and said, "Could you tell her I'd like to speak to her, please?"
Ooh, I love that. Oh, it's so cool to hear your fiction. I had no idea that you had a piece in that book.
Thanks. Yeah.
Oh, I'm in. I want to know what's going on there. What's going on in her house?
Yeah.
My brain's like, what's going on? I love it. Oh, thank you so much, Colette.
Oh, you're welcome.
Really appreciate you doing this. And thank you so much for joining us for Typewriter Talks. We will be back next Tuesday for episode 32. And if you want to know more about Keep St. Pete Lit, we have writing classes, poetry open mics, book clubs, all kinds of things. You can go to keepstpetelit.org. And thank you again. And we will see you all next week.